Time lock. A mind beyond minutes. Sarah Chen stared at the pristine white ceiling of the university research lab, counting backward from 100. She was participant number 47 in a groundbreaking study on memory enhancement, or at least that's what the flyer had promised. The $500 compensation would help cover this month's rent at her cramped graduate student apartment. The medication should take effect within 15 minutes, Dr. Wallace said, checking his tablet. You may experience some mild disorientation as your neural pathways adjust. This is completely normal. Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the metallic taste coating her tongue from the small blue pill. As a neuroscience PhD student herself, she understood the importance of human trials. Still, something about Dr. Wallace's calm demeanor felt rehearsed, almost artificial. The first indication that something was wrong came at minute 12. Sarah was scrolling through her phone when the words began to blur, not from poor vision, but because her brain was processing them faster than her eyes could move. She blinked rapidly, trying to force her perception back to normal speed. "Dr. Wallace?" she called out, her voice sounding distant and stretched. "I think something's happening." But Dr. Wallace had stepped out, leaving her alone in the sterile examination room. The wall clock ticked forward with excruciating slowness, each second dragging like thick honey. Sarah stood up, fighting against what felt like invisible molasses in the air. Her movements were smooth but impossibly slow, as if she were suspended in deep water. The door handle turned at a glacial pace when she tried to leave. By the time she made it to the hallway, what should have been a 10-second walk had stretched into what felt like hours. Her mind raced at impossible speeds while the world crawled by. "Hello?" she called out, but her voice emerged as a deep, distorted growl. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in slow motion, each flash lasting minutes. The emergency exit sign at the end of the hall pulsed like a dying star. Sarah pulled out her phone again, fingers moving with agonizing deliberation. The screen showed 2:47 p.m. She had taken the pill at 2:35 p.m. 12 minutes had passed in real time, but to her accelerated consciousness, it felt like days. The text message she tried to compose to her roommate Emma took an eternity. "Something wrong, at neuroscience building, need help." She watched the loading animation spiral for what seemed like hours before the message sent. No immediate response. Of course not. Every second for others was like a year in her current state. The hallway stretched before her like an endless tunnel. Sarah began walking, each step a carefully choreographed battle against time itself. The sound of her footsteps reached her ears as deep, thunderous booms. Other noises, distant voices, the building's air conditioning, a door closing somewhere, were pitched so low they were barely audible. She reached the main laboratory area, where other researchers usually worked. Today, it was eerily empty. On a desk, she spotted Dr. Wallace's tablet, the screen still active. Moving with painful slowness, she reached for it. The open document made her blood run cold. Subject 47, Test Group C, Compound, NT2184, Neural Acceleration. Previous subjects showed severe psychological deterioration after 6+ hours of temporal displacement. Recommend immediate termination of trials. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a slow, crushing pressure. 6 hours? At her current perception rate, that would feel like multiple lifetimes. She had to find help now. The elevator was out of the question. She couldn't bear the thought of being trapped in a box for what would feel like months. She pushed through the door to the stairwell, the metal bar moving like it was submerged in concrete. Each step down was an exercise in patience and precision. One misstep at this speed could mean experiencing every excruciating moment of a fall in perfect detail. The 3 flights of stairs took what felt like weeks to descend. The building's lobby was populated by a handful of people, all moving like statues caught in amber. A student's coffee cup hung suspended in mid-air, drops of liquid frozen in space. A professor's papers drifted toward the ground like feathers in zero gravity. Sarah weaved between them, a ghost moving through a frozen world. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything in honey gold light. Trees swayed with impossible slowness, their leaves creating patterns that Sarah's hyper-accelerated mind could track individually. Cars crawled along the streets like snails, their engine sounds reduced to subsonic rumbles she felt more than heard. Her apartment was only 4 blocks away, but at this speed, it might as well have been across the country. Still, she had no choice. She began walking, then running, her movements feeling disconnected from reality. The trip took what felt like months in her perception. By the time she reached her building, the sun had barely moved in the sky. Her hand shook as she entered the key code, each button press an eternity. Emma was home, frozen mid-step in their living room. Sarah tried to speak, but her roommate showed no reaction to the low-frequency growls that emerged. On their whiteboard, Sarah began writing, each letter taking hours to form. Drugged at lab. Mind too fast. Need hospital. She watched as Emma's eyes slowly tracked to the board, pupils dilating over the course of minutes as she read. Understanding dawned on her face with glacial speed. Emma's hand moved toward her phone. Sarah collapsed onto their couch, exhausted not physically but mentally. She had experienced more consecutive conscious time in the past hour than most people do in months. The human mind wasn't meant to process reality at this speed. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her consciousness raced on while her body remained bound by normal time. She began counting her heartbeats to maintain sanity, reaching numbers in the thousands while Emma was still dialing 911. The next perceived week was a blur of slow-motion activity. Paramedics moved like underwater dancers. The ambulance crawled through streets while Sarah experienced every microsecond of the journey. The emergency room was a tableau of frozen tragedy. Doctors suspended mid-stride, patients caught in eternal moments of pain or worry. They administered something, another pill that took centuries to dissolve on her tongue. Gradually, impossibly, the world began to speed up. Sound returned to normal frequencies. Movement became fluid again. Time resumed its natural flow. "You're lucky," the attending physician told her later. The compound was experimental, designed to enhance neural processing for military applications. Most test subjects experienced severe psychological trauma from the temporal displacement. Some never fully recovered. Sarah nodded, feeling ancient and newborn at the same time. "What happened to Dr. Wallace?" "Gone. The whole research team vanished when we started investigating. We found evidence of other trials, other subjects. Some reported experiencing years of subjective time in just a few hours. The mind can break under that kind of strain." Sarah was released the next day, but sleep remained elusive. How could she rest when she had already experienced a lifetime of consciousness in a single afternoon? Her dreams, when they came, were of infinite moments stretched like taffy, of thoughts racing through an endless void. 2 weeks later, she received an anonymous email. "Subject 47. We apologize for the unauthorized trial. Your data was invaluable. Time is humanity's first prison, but soon we'll have the key. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. W." Sarah deleted the email and looked out her window at the sunset. The colors changed at their natural pace, but something in her mind still raced ahead, always counting, always aware of each fraction of a second as it passed. She had experienced what it meant to be trapped in time, to be conscious for what felt like years while the world barely moved. The human mind was like a computer. It could be overclocked, pushed beyond its limits, but at what cost? That night, as she lay in bed watching the minutes tick by on her clock, Sarah wondered about the other test subjects. Were they out there somewhere, their minds still racing, experiencing decades while everyone else experienced days? Had they found peace, or were they still trapped in their private eternities? She thought about Dr. Wallace and his team, about their quest to break free from time itself. Perhaps they had succeeded. Their consciousness accelerated to the point where normal time became meaningless. Perhaps they were still out there, moving so fast that the rest of the world appeared frozen, conducting their research in the spaces between seconds. The next morning, Sarah withdrew from her PhD program. She couldn't bear to spend time in laboratories anymore, knowing what she knew. But late at night, when sleep evaded her, she would sometimes catch herself counting seconds, feeling the ghost of that infinite afternoon when time lost all meaning. She kept the email, encrypted and buried in a folder on her laptop. Sometimes she was tempted to reply, to ask the questions that haunted her. How many others were there? What happened to them? What was the true purpose of the research? But she knew better. Some questions were better left unanswered. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. And time, she had learned, was not a constant, but a prison. One that could be escaped, but only at the cost of your sanity. Years later, Sarah would still occasionally experience moments where time seemed to slip, where her thoughts would race ahead while the world moved in slow motion. Brief glimpses into that afternoon when she lived a lifetime in hours. During these episodes, she would close her eyes and count her heartbeats, waiting for reality to normalize. The drug had long since left her system, but its effects had permanently altered how she perceived reality. She had touched the infinite and returned, but part of her would always remain in that endless afternoon, running through a world of statues, experiencing eternity one stretched second at a time. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she would dream of Dr. Wallace and his team, imagining them existing between moments, conducting their research in a realm where time had no meaning. And in these dreams, they were always smiling, always watching, always waiting for the next subject to join them in their endless now. The ghost's jewelry box. Elisabeth Marshall wants it back. Being a sophomore at Riverside High in Massachusetts, I never expected to encounter anything supernatural on our class trip to the historic Marshall University campus. But what happened during those 3 days changed my perspective on reality forever. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is my story from the spring of 2024. It started when our school announced the educational tour to Marshall University, one of the oldest universities in New England. The campus is known for its prestigious academic programs and historic architecture dating back to the 1800s. Initially, my parents were hesitant about letting me go. 3 days away from home seemed like a lot, especially given some concerning incidents that had happened in the area years ago. But after our teachers assured them about the strict supervision and security measures, they finally agreed. The excitement among my friends was electric. My best friend Madison and I spent weeks planning our trip. Not just the educational aspects, but also all the content we wanted to create for our social media. We were particularly excited about making aesthetic videos, showcasing the historic buildings and beautiful campus grounds. Madison was our group's unofficial creative director, always knowing exactly how to capture the perfect shot. When we arrived at the university guest house, we immediately noticed something unusual. The staff were incredibly strict with the female students, much more so than with the males. They handed us a list of rules that seemed straight out of the 1950s. No short clothing, no open hair, no perfumes, and most surprisingly, a strict 6 p.m. curfew. The boys had no such restrictions. "This is ridiculous," Madison whispered to me as we read through the rules. "It's like we're in prison." Even more strange was when the staff sprinkled what they called blessed water at the entrance before letting us in. They claimed it was part of their traditional welcome ceremony, but something about it felt off. The first day went according to plan. Campus tours, library visits, and lectures about the university's history. But everything changed when Madison, our other friend Jessica, and I discovered Marshall Hall. It wasn't on our official tour route. We spotted it while walking between the University Museum and the library, an imposing Victorian mansion standing apart from the main campus buildings. The structure was gorgeous despite its obvious state of disrepair, with elaborate architectural details and huge windows that caught the afternoon light. "That would make an amazing backdrop for our videos," Madison said, already pulling out her phone. The building wasn't locked, just latched. We knew we probably shouldn't, but the allure of creating unique content in such a historic setting was too tempting. Inside, dust motes danced in the rays of light that streamed through broken windows. The floors creaked beneath our feet, and cobwebs decorated every corner. Then we found the locked room. It was behind an ornate iron gate, the kind you'd see in old horror movies. Jessica, always the adventurous one, managed to work the old lock open with a hairpin. What we found inside would haunt me forever. The room was mostly empty except for a large portrait on the wall, a woman in Victorian-era clothing, and beneath it, on a small table, lay the most beautiful necklace I'd ever seen. It was an antique piece with deep blue stones that seemed to catch and amplify the dim light. Despite the room's thick layer of dust, the necklace sparkled as if it had been polished yesterday. Jessica was immediately drawn to it. Before Madison or I could stop her, she'd picked it up and clasped it around her neck. "This will be perfect for our video," she said, already posing. We spent the next hour creating content in the mansion, with Jessica wearing the necklace in every shot. When we finally left, she secretly took it with her, despite my protests. "No one's been in here for years," she argued. "Besides, it's just costume jewelry someone left behind." That night, things started getting weird. Our room at the guest house was a triple, with Jessica taking the bed nearest the window. I woke up around 3 a.m. to find her sitting upright, staring at her reflection in the window glass, repeatedly putting on and removing the necklace. When I called out to her, she didn't respond. "She's been doing that for hours," Madison whispered from her bed. "And I keep hearing footsteps in the room, but when I look, no one's there." The next day, Jessica wasn't herself. She barely touched her breakfast and kept wandering off during our scheduled activities. Eventually, she led us back to Marshall Hall, moving as if in a trance. Madison and I followed, worried about her strange behavior. Inside the mansion, everything felt different. The air was heavier, and our footsteps echoed differently. Jessica walked straight back to the portrait room, but this time, we weren't alone. A figure appeared. The woman from the portrait, but somehow both solid and transparent at the same time. Her period dress flowed around her as if caught in an unfelt wind. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. What followed was pure chaos. The woman, or spirit, began pursuing us through the mansion. Every time we tried to escape, we found ourselves back in the same corridors. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where geography stopped making sense. Up became down, exits became entrances, and every route led back to the portrait room. Finally, exhausted and terrified, we found ourselves back in front of the portrait. The spirit materialized again, but this time her demeanor was different, desperate rather than menacing. "Please," she pleaded. "I don't want to hurt you. I need help. I've been trapped here for so long." Through our terror, we learned her story. Her name was Elisabeth Marshall, and she had been the lady of the house in the late 1800s. Her husband had been having an affair, and when she confronted him, he murdered her in that very room, burning her body to hide the evidence. The necklace had been her most precious possession, and her spirit remained bound to it. "He was never punished," she told us. "My body was never found. I remain here, trapped between worlds, wearing this necklace for eternity." Suddenly, Elisabeth's form changed, becoming more corporeal, more menacing. "You took what's mine!" she shrieked at Jessica, who was still wearing the necklace. The spirit lunged forward, and both Madison and I lost consciousness. We woke up surrounded by guest house staff and teachers. Jessica was hysterical, the necklace nowhere to be found. The staff wasn't surprised by our story. Apparently, similar incidents had happened before, which explained their strict rules for female guests. They told us the mansion was known to be haunted, and several young women had been possessed after taking Elisabeth's necklace. "The blessed water at the entrance isn't just tradition," one staff member explained. "It's protection. Elisabeth's spirit is drawn to young women who remind her of herself, especially those who share her love of beauty and jewelry." That was 6 months ago. Jessica still has nightmares, and sometimes she wakes up feeling like she's wearing something around her neck. Madison and I returned to normal life, but we're different now. We know there are things in this world that can't be explained, stories that aren't just stories. The strangest part? When we went back to Marshall Hall the next day, the portrait was gone. But in every photo and video we took while Jessica was wearing the necklace, you can see a woman in Victorian dress standing in the background, wearing an identical necklace, smiling directly at the camera. I've heard the university has since sealed off Marshall Hall completely, but sometimes students still report seeing a woman in period dress walking the grounds at night, touching her neck as if looking for something lost. And in the old mansion's windows, even with the power disconnected, lights sometimes flicker in the portrait room, as if someone is admiring their reflection in the glass. They say Elisabeth is still waiting there, hoping to find someone who can help her get justice. The necklace appears every few years, always to a young woman who reminds her of herself, and every time, the cycle repeats. I still have questions that haunt me. Where did the necklace go? Will it appear again? And most troublingly, did Elisabeth ever find peace? Or is she still there, waiting in Marshall Hall, looking for someone else to tell her story? Some nights, when I can't sleep, I wonder if somewhere in that old mansion, behind the sealed doors and covered windows, a beautiful necklace sits gathering dust, waiting for the next person to be drawn to its mysterious gleam. But this time, I hope they know better than to take what isn't theirs, especially when it belongs to someone who never truly left. 3 claps at midnight. The horrors of Miller's Creek. There are things in this world that defy explanation. Creatures that lurk just beneath the surface of what we consider normal. I never believed in any of that until last summer in Miller's Creek, Maine. What happened there changed everything I thought I knew about reality. My name is Jack Thompson, and this is my story. It started when my father noticed fish going missing from our family's commercial fish pond. We're one of the largest suppliers of farm-raised trout in northern Maine, and after 3 generations in the business, we know our numbers. Something wasn't adding up. "Jack," my dad said one morning over breakfast, "inventory's down again. 3rd month in a row. Either someone's stealing or something's eating our stock." I gathered my 3 closest friends, Mike, Connor, and Dave, to help investigate. We'd grown up together, spending summers swimming in these same ponds, so we knew every inch of the property. The plan was simple: set up a stakeout and catch whoever or whatever was taking our fish. "We'll split up, cover all 4 ponds," I suggested during our planning session in the barn. "Keep our phones on silent, use hand signals if we spot anything." Mike, always the practical one, suggested we establish a signal system. 2 claps for all clear, 3 for need help, he said. We all agreed it made sense. Sound would carry better than phone lights in the dark. Our first daylight watch proved uneventful. We sat for hours under the hot Maine sun, watching ripples on the water and occasionally checking our phones. Nothing seemed out of place except the occasional splash of a jumping fish. "Tonight," Connor said as we regrouped. "Whatever's happening, it's happening at night." That evening, we met at midnight. The humidity hung thick in the air, and an unusual fog had rolled in from the coast, creating an eerie blanket over the ponds. We took our positions. I stayed at the main pond, Mike took the east pond, Connor the west, and Dave headed to the north pond. The first hour passed quietly. Too quietly. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, just dead silence and that strange fog. Around 1:30 a.m., I decided to check in with everyone. 2 claps echoed across the property. 2 responses came back immediately. But Dave's signal was different. 1, 2, 3 claps. We froze. That wasn't the plan. I clapped twice again, and the same thing happened. 2 responses, then that 3-clap pattern from Dave's direction. "He's messing with us," Mike whispered when we regrouped. But Connor shook his head. "Dave doesn't mess around like that. Something's wrong." We clapped again. 1, 2, 3 came the response, but this time it sounded further away, deeper into the woods beyond the north pond. Then again, even further. We should have called the police. We should have gone back to the house. Instead, we followed the sound. As we approached the north pond, we saw a flashlight beam cutting through the fog. A figure was walking toward us. "Dave?" I called out. "Been waiting for you guys," Dave's voice responded. "Where'd you go? I've been looking everywhere." Something was off about his voice, about the way he moved. He seemed fluid, like his joints weren't quite right. "What happened?" Connor asked. "Why'd you leave your post?" "Just come closer," Dave said. "I need to show you something in the pond." That's when we saw the real Dave stumbling out of the woods behind us, soaking wet and trembling. Don't listen to it," he gasped. "It's not me. I saw. The figure with the flashlight stopped moving. The beam of light dropped, illuminating the ground, and what we saw made my blood run cold. Where there should have been feet, there was only water, shaped like feet but flowing, constantly moving. The thing wearing Dave's voice laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "The poet wants to meet you," it said. "The poet has such verses to share." Dave collapsed, shaking violently. We grabbed him and ran back toward the house, the sound of that terrible laugh following us through the fog. That night was just the beginning of our nightmare. Over the next week, Dave changed. He barely ate, rarely left his room, and when he did speak, it was in strange, lyrical patterns that made no sense. His mother called us in tears, saying he was talking to things that weren't there, trying to drown their family cat in the bathtub, and speaking about someone called the poet who lived in the deep places. The local doctors were useless. They talked about post-traumatic stress, about possible hallucinations from toxic algae exposure. But we knew what we'd seen. Finally, Dave's mother reached out to an old woman who lived on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Blackwood was known locally as a healer, though most people used less polite terms. The moment she saw Dave, she burned sage and started praying. "Your boy's been touched by a water poet," she said, her voice grave. "Ancient things, older than these lands. They're drawn to the places where water meets earth, where life can be given and taken. They're jealous gods. Hungry gods." "Gods?" I asked. "Or demons? Or something in between?" she replied. "The native peoples knew about them, left offerings to keep them satisfied, but the old ways were forgotten, and now they take what they want." She explained that the water poet wasn't alone. It had a companion, something she called a pandu, a water spirit that dragged its victims down into the mud, burying them alive upside down as a tribute to its own twisted sense of poetry. "The 3 claps," Connor whispered. "That was the pandu trying to lure us in." Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "They work together. The poet distracts, creates illusions, while the pandu kills. Your friend is lucky. The poet marked him, but the pandu didn't get to finish its work." She told us about other victims, dozens of them over the years, found buried headfirst in the mud of ponds and rivers across New England. The official reports called them drownings or accidents, but the pattern was always the same. 3 claps in the night, a familiar voice calling out, then another body found upside down in the muck. It took 3 days of rituals, but Mrs. Blackwood finally drove whatever had attached itself to Dave out of him. He remembered everything. The water poet appearing to him as a beautiful pattern of light on the pond's surface, trying to lure him deeper into the water. The pandu's cold hands grabbing his ankles. The only thing that saved him was a sudden flash of his grandfather's old cross around his neck, which made the creatures recoil just long enough for him to break free. "They're angry," Dave told us afterward. "The poet showed me things. Memories. People used to worship them, leave offerings of fish and flowers. Now we build over their waters, poison their homes with chemicals, take their fish without asking. They're not just hungry, they're vengeful." We sold the fish farm 6 months later. The new owners thought we were crazy when we insisted they maintain the old traditions. Monthly offerings of fresh fish left by the water's edge, prayers spoken at dawn and dusk. They probably still think we're superstitious fools. But every now and then, I read about another body found in a pond or river, buried upside down in the mud. And on quiet nights, when the fog rolls in thick over the water, I sometimes hear it. 1, 2, 3 claps, followed by a voice I know calling out from the darkness. The water poet is still out there, still hungry, still waiting for someone to ignore the warnings and come a little too close to the water's edge, and the pandu follows in its wake, ready to add another verse to their eternal deadly poem. If you're ever by a pond or river at night, and you hear 3 claps followed by a familiar voice, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because what's calling to you isn't what it seems, and the next verse of the poet's song might be written with your last breath. We never did figure out what was happening to our fish. Dad installed security cameras before we sold the place, but they never caught anything, just odd ripples in the water at night. And sometimes, if you listened carefully to the recordings, the sound of someone reciting poetry in a language that no living person speaks anymore. Some of the old-timers around here say there are more water poets awakening these days, stirred from their slumber by changing waters and forgotten traditions. They say each one has its own pandu, its own hunting ground, its own preferred way of adding to their endless collection of victims. Dave still won't go near any body of water larger than a bathtub. Mike moved to Arizona, about as far from large bodies of water as he could get. Connor became obsessed with researching similar incidents across the country. He's got a wall full of news clippings about mysterious drownings and bodies found in impossible positions. As for me, I still live in Maine, but I've learned to respect the water in a way I never did before. When I fish, I leave an offering. When I swim, I say the old prayers. And when the fog rolls in thick over the water, I make sure I'm safely inside before dark. Because sometimes, on those foggy nights, I can hear it. The sound of water moving in impossible ways, 3 distinct claps echoing across the surface. And beneath it all, the whispered verses of an ancient, hungry poet, still waiting for its next audience. The local historical society has records of similar incidents going back to the colonial era. Reports of people hearing loved ones' voices calling them to the water, of 3 claps in the night, of bodies found posed like macabre poetry in the mud. The native peoples who lived here first tried to warn the settlers, but their warnings were dismissed as superstition. They say every water poet has its own territory, its own Pandu enforcer, its own preferred type of victim. Ours seemed to favor young men who worked with fish. The Historical Society found records of at least 6 local fishermen who disappeared under similar circumstances in the past century alone. I've often wondered if we did the right thing by selling the farm. Maybe we were supposed to be there, keeping the old traditions alive, maintaining some sort of balance. But after what happened to Dave, after what we saw that night, some things you just can't unsee, some knowledge you can't unlearn. The new owners filled in 2 of the ponds and turned them into parking lots. The fish farm failed within a year. Now it's just another abandoned property slowly being reclaimed by nature. But sometimes, people driving past at night say they can see figures dancing on the surface of the remaining ponds, moving in ways that human bodies can't move, keeping time to the rhythm of 3 slow claps. The water poet and its Pandu are still there, still hungry, still waiting. And somewhere in the deep, dark waters of Miller's Creek, they're composing new verses, waiting for their next audience, ready to add another chapter to their endless, deadly song. Just remember, if you're ever near the water at night and you hear 3 claps followed by a familiar voice, don't answer. Don't look back. Just run. Because some poems aren't meant to be heard by the living, and some audiences never leave the theater alive.